fortunately, unfortunately, we have a pretty low cost of living in this part of the world, right? I mean, all things considered, which means that, and we also have something else, which is like, it's totally normal for, people to live with their parents until they're 30, right?
True.
So let's take those two examples, right? All right. Very little risk, right? So think about it, like a typical person that might be a stellar engineer or somebody that's thinking about, that's a creative person, that's a creator, that's a builder, right? He gets, offered maybe to go work at a big company, right? It's the dream that they've been, whether it's Microsoft or others, whatever.
Have this big name in the city.
Yeah, whatever you replace with whatever industry that's true. That they've made it, right? So in that storyline, that we've been told, go to school, have good grades, get a job. That today is happening, right? And people are, living at home with parents, and they're thinking, okay, I need to go get that job in order to have that, financial freedom. But then they still live with the parents, and then after a few years it's over. So to me, when I think of, people that are at Stanford, that is a diametrically opposite point of view. Most people that are thinking about starting companies are ideating or starting companies at 20, 21, 22. The reason is because you have nothing to lose except your time.
Hello, Recursive community, to our next podcast episode here in Belgrade. Our next guest is helping marketers all over the world have a scalable process for user acquisition, engagement, and storytelling through social media. Sinisa Rakovic is the CEO and the co-founder of Hunch, a marketing technology company focusing on creative intelligence. Sinisa is also a serial entrepreneur with several successful exits behind his back. He graduated from California State University and spent also time at Stanford University. Sinisa, welcome to the Recursive podcast. I'm very happy that you're here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and super excited to have this chat with you.
Yeah. Somehow I feel like you're kind of a colleague, because I've been always doing kind of media and marketing for various companies, especially in tech. And I see that this is where you thrive right now.
Yeah, well, media and tech are, a good place to be today, right? The convergence of the two are definitely places where lots of innovation's happening.
I'm going to ask you a bit more about Hunch, but I wanted to go back a bit in time and bring you to the beginning of your entrepreneurial journey. How did you find the entrepreneurial drive? When did you felt like, okay, this is where I want to go to?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I think everybody that comes from this part of the world, the Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe, I think we've all been brought up in this, go to school, get a job, and work at that job until your career sunsets, right? And then I had the opportunity to move to a different part of the world, which was Southern California, and then you sort of meet different mindsets there, and you have different viewpoints. And so I think part of the people that I spent time with during my high school and my university time, the close friends of mine, all of their families were entrepreneurial families. They all had businesses. And so ultimately, they influenced in how, and basically had, make myself ask the question, well, if they can be entrepreneurs, right, why am I thinking of not being an entrepreneur? So it's one of those things where in your 20s, you're questioning things around in the world and how the world works. And, at that time, it was like, okay, there were some specific political events happening during that time. And so there was this, opportunity to sort of bridge the gap between, the Balkans to the Eastern European world with my time there, which was, the Western world with capital and business and markets and so forth. So, naively, as a 20-something-year-old, you're thinking that you can do anything, right? And so the idea was, as I was spending time, and I saw this happening with our friends when they were traveling the world and, conquering their sort of, ambitions. It was like, okay, why can't we do it? So it was definitely a step out of the, comfort zone. It wasn't, something that I personally was, brought up with. But that was the initial trigger, which was like, hey, if they can do it, I can do it, right? And it was like pushing myself to do it.
That's exactly the message that we would like also to send to maybe younger generations through the podcast. So I'm very happy that she's saying exactly. How much time did you spend in the States? Roughly,
I want to say from about 16 years or so. So the formative years between 10 and 26 was full time, and then between 26 and 30 was half the year there and back.
How did you stay connected to the Balkans? I mean, why would you decide to bridge the gap? You were probably also very happy to staying there.
It's a good question. It's a really good question. I don't in particular have a reason as to what. I think it was a sort of, there was something that was missing in my life at that point, and it was one of those callings that, hey, we have a very nice life in Europe. There's nothing missing, and so we went to California. A very nice life in California, but there was you always feel like, what if I go back? What if, or I didn't want my life in California to go on without sort of testing, like, what if I went back to Europe? Would I be successful? And so that was the initial. The thing that actually, the glue that stuck everything together, or, the thing that actually made it work was the fact that I met, the love of my life, which was in Europe. So I came back and was going back and forth 4 years. It was more for fun, but during those fun times, there was also, thinking like, okay, there's lots of opportunity here. And so that's when, we sort of formed that. So that was, I would say, the reason of going back. But I think while I was here, you see all these opportunities, right? Super smart people, super driven people, super intelligent people. And so for me, actually, growing up in Southern California, if you have an idea, or if you wanted to do something, it's super competitive to build the right team to do it, right? So, part of it, the trigger of going back was, it was easier to find those individuals, that I could build a company with, the partners, I think, from a tech side.
Very much true. I think, especially when you want to test out an idea, when you want to build like an MVP, it's much more opportunistic to do it from here than, spend a lot of time and energy and money, capital in the States.
It still is. I mean, this is back in 2005. So this is before, startup was the thing, right? Before it was actually defined, it's before Y Combinator became a thing, right? So it's, at that time, I think it wasn't even like when we started the company, we called it like a feasibility study. It's like, it wasn't a business plan, right? So it was one of those things where we didn't know what we were doing, but we were building, essentially what today would be, a startup environment.
I think, didn't know what you're doing is part of the preconditions, to build a company. Otherwise, if you knew what it's called following ahead, you would never start that. In any case, what was your first venture?
The first company was called Building Explorer. It was essentially a company that built in the virtual design and construction space. It still operates today, got acquired by a big sort of, construction real estate company. Now it's on, 100 projects across the world, some very, impressive projects. So that team kept on, chucking away and building it. But it was a super interesting technology. Again, it had to do with automation and had to do with sort of, at that time, AI wasn't called AI, neural networks and so forth, about, how do you automate, or let's say, how do you automate the construction process before it gets built, to see certain things that might go wrong and then, save costs and be more efficient in your building process. It's a very, very innovative technology.
So you were successful already from the first step, more or less. Exiting the first company is already very encouraging to continue your journey. It
was, with everything, everything else constant, every project can be viewed as a success, even those that fail. Success by definition means that, you're learning and you're growing, right? That, at least for me, is, right? So, it's not only materialistic. I always say that, it wasn't, it was a good, let's say, a good way to learn fast, so that growth curve, the individual growth curve, the team growth curve. For me, the success is, working with, people that are just as dedicated as you, that want to grow, right, that help you grow. And in the end, you think of, even when it's a smaller success or a bigger success, what really you look back towards is all the time that you spend in sort of the battle of building something, right, with the teams, with the people. And so that's something that, that I view as success. If you have that, you're already successful, right? The markets might say how successful you might become in the end, right? But I think, at the individual level, if you strip away, the capital, if you strip away everything, at the individual level, being successful means that, you're happy with what you're doing, that you're, that gives you wind in your sails, that you're in your, what, somebody calls the zone of genius, that you're constantly growing, constantly innovating, and you have support in that. And hopefully something in the end, might materialize out of that in those terms. We were fortunate to have all of those, to a certain degree. And that essentially gave us, even though like we went all in, not knowing what we were doing, and just sort of building as we, the perennial, sort of definition of you jump out of an airplane and you have to build that parachute. That's essentially what startups are, right?
Sure.
And as you're falling, you're building that parachute to have a safer landing. And so, that gave us, the little success that we had, for me personally, gave me the opportunity to say, okay, this is a super interesting way to live a life in terms of defining, problems that you want to solve, solving those, and in that whole journey. So that's the reason why the next company happened, was because we knew that it was possible. If you have the right team and if you're all aligned and you want to do something, there's absolutely nothing that can stop you. It's a matter of time, how fast you learn, right? So that's the reason why I think, startups are, an amazing place to be, because they're, they drive, they have this internal inertia for each person. It gives you this sort of drive that, you need to succeed, that you need to, solve a small problem, then a bigger problem, then a bigger problem. You keep growing and keep solving problems. And it's definitely never, boring, for sure. It's never repetitive. You're always in a new thing. You're always solving a new challenge, whether it's a smaller team of 6 people, or if it's 12 people, or if it's now 50 people or 100 people. There's different challenges, and you always have this feeling of that you haven't solved that challenge before, right? So that's both good and bad, because the good part is it's a new challenge, and you figure things out of how to solve it, and you fail hundreds of times, right, before you solve it. There's definitely battle scars of failure on every entrepreneur, on every CEO, at every level, right? It's just a matter of, how big those scars are. We had a discussion just recently with some very, CEOs and founders. We were just talking about that. How do you, maybe circumvent the system of not having those, or growing as an organization grows? How do you, for example, as you scale from 30 people to 70 people, it's different operations, it's different things. How do you solve for that? Well, you fail, right? You fail, and you fail fast, and you keep growing, and you figure things out, and then you make it work.
I think you totally change your perspective on failure. This is the one thing that is for sure happening.
Yep.
But I wonder, I've been talking to several founders who successfully exited their companies. Maybe not the first, maybe already the second, whatever. What I find interesting is that they never really do a sabbatical afterwards. They never really, go easy afterwards. They don't go and, go to the Maldives and have a calm life. Usually they go back on the battlefield. So I'm wondering, is there also part of an addiction to the whole thing?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's absolutely. I think that could probably be relatable to the military being in battle, and somebody that you take somebody out of battle and they have this feeling that they need to go back. I think it's. I don't know where I read that or saw that, but there's definitely. Maybe an addiction is a strong word because it has negative connotations. I wouldn't call it that, because it's positive in a sense. But there's definitely when you get to certain, let's say you succeed, right? Let's say there's an exit event. I don't recall any champagne moments. There's none of that, right? It's just what's the next thing, right? And so builders have they're wired differently, not from the start. You wire yourself to be differently, to think of problems and drive. So I would say, I think it's definitely once you're done, it's what's next? It's not once you're done and you're okay, now I'm done. And some people find that challenge in different formats, right? Sure. Maybe they want to build the biggest house, or they want to build something else, and that's a challenge, right? That's next for them. Or they want to go from startups towards investments, and then that's a challenge, But yeah, I mean, there's, being an operator, being, sort of executing is different than, maybe the next stage where you may be helping the community. So that's a good question. When you talk to your other CEOs, what's the end game, right? Once you're done, are you constantly building new things, or is there a certain point where, you can help, build the ecosystem in a certain way and be more efficient?
I think it inevitably comes to this point where you feel like there is a certain moment of when you start giving back, when you want to create the basis for a systemic success of those around you. for more entrepreneurs to come, for the next entrepreneurs to become even more successful than you are. I think this is at some point coming to the life of a successful.
Yeah, that was part of our, that's part of our core mission or DNA for all of people involved in the current company, Hunch. Everybody to some degree has this, feeling that there needs to be a bridge that needs to be built for the next generation of, people that are going to be building companies, right? We almost feel like, okay, it's funny, it's maybe funny to say, but like being the first generation, you're not the first generation. There's thousands of successful entrepreneurs, in this part of the world, obviously. But in this format, in terms of tech and venture capital, there wasn't, 100 success stories, right? Like we don't have, a unicorn, and maybe there's one in the region in Romania, right? So like building the sort of, that atmosphere for that to happen is something that, I think we're all committed to. So like our partners, including our investors, including our founders, we all have this, drive that is higher than just Hunch, right? It's more about, building a success story, not just for the success of one company. It's really to attract for the next 10 to be successful, right?
And it's exactly that. So I consider unicorns a bit of like a vanity metric, but
yeah,
it is still
true.
an important
Absolutely.
metric because it puts us basically on the global map of, tech entrepreneurship. So we have now one decacorn in between, and then they went like public, the UAP app.
Yep.
Guys in Romania. We have the PayHawk in Bulgaria. We have in Greece Vivo Wallets. I think Serbia will be probably coming next with their own unicorn. But this is, I think, the next big question. So we don't want the outlier companies. We actually want, I think, a very good middle class of entrepreneurs,
exactly.
which are going to be like the backbone of.
And so how does that build, right? So we can ask the question, how do you create the infrastructure for that to happen, right?
Exactly.
There's, a government, can do its job, but ultimately, they're doing, of course. But the other, the other part is like, how do you take all the stories, the micro failures, and how do you, loop them back into the next generation of successful entrepreneurs, right? And so, I'll give you an example for today. And I don't know about the region. I can only speak locally, in Belgrade. There's a very, small community of people that you can tap into. It's almost non-existent in terms of helping you solve specific challenges at a specific time. Like, so even like in the startup community, like let's look at the two extremes, right? You walk in San Francisco, or you walk in Berlin, or you walk in London. The ecosystem, you probably easier for you to meet an angel investor that was a previous entrepreneur that might, fund your company with a small ticket investor. But more importantly, it's not the capital. More importantly, it's getting the time of that experience of helping you, think and ask the right questions, to solve specific problems and think ahead and so forth. That, in this part of the world is almost non-existent, right? So that part of like knowledge transfer is very, very low. And I think, speaking from my experience, obviously it's not for everybody's, but it's in terms of that, I call it CEO therapy sessions,
Thank you.
In terms of like, having, talking about certain problems, whether it's pre-seed product building stage, whether it's seed stage, whether it's, revenue stage, whether it's, Series A stage. There are 1,001, a myriad of different problems that pop up and questions. And so building the right mentorship, the right sort of support organizations is really what drives and propels companies forward. And so, I would say it's such an anomaly for one person to do it himself. It's almost non-existent, right? If you look at every successful, entrepreneur, there's probably somebody that they relied on, they have as a coach.
I was just about to ask you.
Whether it's like
who are your mentors over the years?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I draw from many different sources, right? I wouldn't say that there's one. I've had, successful mentors and coaches in the past that were, that maybe didn't think that they were coaches, right? But they were. And so I learned from many different people about many different subjects. But I wouldn't say that I had one, that I can rely on and grow. And that's actually part of, every entrepreneur should have, a way to figure out who is that person that they can, rely on for the next stage of growth. So currently, for example, I'm definitely looking for, the right, to tap into the right person that can help us go from the current stage we're at towards the next stage, right? So that's, and part of that comes from the board. So if you have, a board, you definitely can fill some of those gaps in terms of like helping you. But operationally, when things are, great, you talk to somebody, and, when things are bad, you talk to somebody, when things are challenging. Those are this is where, sort of the knowledge transfer happens. This is where, somebody gets a specific, let's call it, idea of how, to change the trajectory of the company or how to, do certain things. So, I mean, for me, ultimately, my mentor is my father. That's who I, grew up with. So that's kind of like the base, I would say. But now in certain business interactions, you try to draw from different people. So I would definitely encourage everybody when they're starting is to have that, I mean, for me, like, having a sparring partner in terms of playing chess, my co-founder, CTO, Igor Simovic, was somebody that, we went back and forth in the early days, hours on end. So that was something that, definitely gives you wind in your sails, that that you have somebody there. And so you triangulate those answers that they're missing, right?
Sure.
By, through that process.
This is why it's important to have a co-founder, I think. And because you mentioned therapy, I think sometimes it's not even about, having the questions and, talking about the practical stuff. Sometimes it's just, being there and being listened to.
Yeah.
Because you're fucking afraid, of doing all these things sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely, in this part of the world, in particular this part of the world, you are, swimming, upstream, or however you want to say it, you're pushing the boulder up the hill, right? Particularly because, think about it, that entrepreneur that has an idea, that wants to work on something, comes home, and he doesn't have an ecosystem that's supportive enough to say, keep chucking at it, don't worry, keep chucking at it, you'll work. It's probably like, are you sure? Are you sure I mean,
that's impossible.
It's like, yeah, it's why don't you just, there's awesome companies you can work at. And so we can go into like why that is, and why we have that mentality and how that's changing a bit with recent sort of developments. But I think ultimately at the very core, this area, I think is an ideal place for innovation to happen, to take that risk, right? If you think about it.
So true. Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I actually wanted to relate to your, connection to entrepreneurship also through, the people in the States, maybe also the people that you met at Stanford. I feel like the entrepreneurial line has been broken in this part of the world, partially because of the communist part that we had in history, because, entrepreneurship wasn't really allowed back then. And, many of them were penalized. So they couldn't build like the next generation of entrepreneurial thinkers. At the same time, we cannot just, copy paste Silicon Valley model into the Balkans because we live in a totally different context. But what we see here is that due maybe to the economic challenges that we've been experiencing and also the crisis, people became very creative. Like they really started thinking out of the box because they didn't have the resources. I mean, you have to do a startup and innovation and a company out of nothing. Yeah. How do you do that? Well, you have to be really, really street smart. So I think this is, and hungry. And I think these are, the two factors that we still currently have. We are street smart and we are hungry. And the only thing that's missing is where do we see the glass ceiling? And this is where the ecosystem comes in to show you that it's not here, but it's actually much higher. And actually there is no glass ceiling.
I would say, I think you're right. I think your characterization is on point. I would say that people don't dream big enough to your point in terms of like what is possible, because they're within their sort of, and that's partly because maybe this region, people haven't experienced and traveled and seen and so forth. If you think of like Berlin, somebody who's in Berlin grew up, traveling to France, Belgium, Netherlands, and so forth, and they see the multicultural, see lots of different people. You see that opportunity, you see that, the ocean is wide and deep. Here perhaps there's, that maybe there's a box around that people are not seeing that. So I think that's one that's definitely true, is people need to be dreaming big, and constantly, and part of that is maybe they don't see that the dreams do become reality because of success stories, and then those that do become success stories are like typically tied to some form of connections with somebody who, the old system of being successful, that you have to have certain things to make it work. So those are the remnants of sort of, perhaps the things that kill that energy.
Yeah. But
yeah, I think from the current, when you look at what the opportunity is, fortunately, unfortunately, we have a pretty low cost of living in this part of the world, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, all things considered, which means that, and we also have something else, which is like, it's totally normal for, people to live with their parents until they're 30, right?
True.
So let's take those two examples, right? Very little risk, right? So think about it, like a typical person that might be a stellar engineer, or somebody that's thinking about, that's a creative person, that's a creator, that's a builder, right? Yeah. He gets, offered maybe to go work at a big company, right? It's the dream that they've been, whether it's Microsoft or
exactly.
Others, whatever.
Have this big name in the city.
Yeah, whatever you replace with whatever industry that's true. That they've made it, right? So in that storyline, that we've been told, go to school, have good grades, get a job. That today is happening, right? And people are, living at home with parents, and they're thinking, okay, I need to go get that job in order to have that, financial freedom. But then they still live with the parents, and then after a few years it's over. So to me, when I think of, people that are at Stanford, that is a diametrically opposite point of view. Most people that are thinking about starting companies are ideating or starting companies at 20, 21, 22. The reason is because you have nothing to lose except your time, right? And so if you take that logic and you say, okay, if somebody starts building ideas and, let's say not living for a salary, right, but living on the idea of building something, right? You consciously have to tell yourself you're not going to have a salary because you have to build, right? 10 years ago, 2005, you probably wouldn't, people will look at you like crazy. Today, they probably wouldn't look at you crazy. There's the ecosystem is building up. There's pre-seed funding, there's seed funding, there's, ways to, help your, story become true, or what you're building become true. But essentially, if you go through the 20s of building something, the learning curve is just much faster, right? You just start, you learn because you have to, right? And the other thing is, I think is important, you get to learn in a broader sort of sense, right? So when you're building a company, there's product, so it's about engineering, it's about research, it's about building the product. But then there's also thinking about customers. Mm-hmm. There's also thinking about, okay, what are my customers? How am I going to reach those customers? How are the customers going to make a decision in order to buy, right? And there's also finance. There's also like, okay, now I have to build a way to get the revenue in. And then there's also, okay, so there, as an entrepreneur or as a builder, you become sort of the master of your universe. You have to know a little bit of everything to begin with, And so that's, I think, what a lot of people, what turns on a lot of people is the fact that they can build themselves as individuals in all these different facets. Versus if you take the extreme example of somebody just coming in and being a coder for one part of and doing that for 3 years, they're still only good at that one thing. They don't know how that connects to the world.
I guess in a good company, also in a startup company, at some point you would need both types of people. So you would need like the multi-potentialites who know a little of everything, but you also have the people who are very good experts in what they're doing. Still, what I'm thinking, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the impression that in our parts of the world, the tradition of marketing and go to market is actually, there is no tradition like that. We lack a bit of the knowledge, unlike, let's say, people in the States who are so good at presenting themselves, so good at selling themselves, that even on an idea they could get already the first customers and the first investors and so on and so forth. And we are much more focusing on building very good products on the engineering part, but then we kind of like suck at selling them and bringing them to the market. And this is where you step in also.
So I would,
Hunch.
well.
So do you feel the same way, or
So yeah, I think broad generalizations obviously are incorrect, but I would say, let me be the sort of contrarian or devil's advocate to your statement. I agree with what you've said. That we are engineering product driven, and that's how we see that we will succeed. But that's also true for most of Europe and most of the US. The reason we have a thought, or we believe that they're different, is because we hear about their successes, right?
Okay.
So for every success, right, there's 1,000 failures. And those 1,000 failures are not because the product wasn't built. The 1,000 failures are because the product didn't find its market, for sure.
That's
right.
Yeah.
So if you think about that, right, and let's say if in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania, there's maybe 100 startups right now that are actively doing. Maybe there's 1,000, but like funded. In a 2-mile radius or 2-kilometer radius in San Francisco, there's maybe 10,000, right, of those same companies in the same stage. So the law of these numbers tell you that they're failing. They're also failing for the similar reason that companies here fail, because maybe they built a product that nobody wants to buy, right? Except we only hear of the successes. You don't hear the failures, right? What I mean, we as in like from the media, right? Because nobody wants to, in TechCrunch, you don't see those 999 who failed.
And we should be seeing those.
You only see one who's like super successful. So, so I'm playing devil's advocate, saying that I think in both camps, whether it's Belgrade, whether it's Sofia, whether it's Bucharest or San Francisco, you have companies that are focusing on product that are not, growing and building because they're only focusing on product. So I agree with your statement that, the other side is lacking to some degree, like the knowledge of, go to market in terms of marketing, in terms of, I think is lacking as maybe a discipline that hasn't been, taught in schools, or there's very little sort of, like if there's a gaming company, let's take that for example, a gaming like as in apps, there's probably maybe like a handful of people that know how to spend $100,000 per month to acquire customers, right? Because the budgets are super low in this part of the world, right? They might be like $5,000 per month, $10,000 per month. That's a different ballgame than somebody spending $100,000 or $500,000 per month in user acquisition. So, one feeds the next, right? So I would say, I think, for this, for the companies in this part of the world, marrying the two, product. But then if you look at UiPath, right, that defies your statement in terms of they chucked away for 7-8 years before they were super successful, and for 7-8 years nobody knew about them, and all of a sudden, boom, they're a unicorn, right? So like I don't think that they got to a point that were, I don't know the whole story, but I'm pretty sure that they were growing slowly. They were successful to some degree, and at some point they went all out. And then you would say, oh yeah, they found a product. They did a good job in marketing. Probably not, but they were probably the best product in the world in terms of automation. So, I think it's both. I think it's both in terms of, maybe a little too much focus on product and not early enough focus on talking to customers, because that's hard, right? And the second thing is, for most tech startups, the customers, which naturally locally, right? So if you're, let's say, building, let's call it you're building Hunch in Belgrade, Serbia. There's very little end customers that understand or have a need for Hunch locally, because we're built for large advertisers that operate globally and so forth, and we help them in terms of be more successful with getting enough images and videos so they can get better revenues and so forth. So if we in that term go through the product marketing, or you talk to customers, you learn to sort of influence your product and so forth, they might give you bad advice. So it's like a catch-22 situation in those terms. So I would say, I think the marketing discipline in general, from a tech growth marketing perspective, is deficient in these parts of the world in terms of the.
What can we learn actually from companies that didn't find their market, about go-to-market strategies which are successfully built? Why are so many companies failing because they cannot find their market?
No, I mean, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I would say it's probably because they're not getting outside of their office, right? They're building in their, cave.
Yeah.
That's it. If you talk to customers, so this is incidentally the, sort of the growth story for Hunch. We started with one, let's call it thesis, right? And we proved that thesis, it was successful. It had to do with data science and Slack, and this is before ChatGPT in terms of like natural language processing. And we had some early customers, right? But no, I mean, those customers, you would need like millions in order for that to be successful. So when we had, our customer development chats, they tell you what they want, what their problems are. And if you're in tune with those problems, you build to those problems and you grow, right? You say, hey, now I have that. So I think in particular, we had a customer in Argentina that said, oh, we need, easier way to make images or easier way to make videos. And then Igor, our CTO, was like, all right, now we have a direction, right? So it's, I think, there's probably, a million reasons why, a startup can fail. But the biggest one is just, building a product that nobody wants to buy.
Exactly. This is why I'm asking you about this one.
Yeah.
Okay, well, tell me, what is creative intelligence? I love the term.
Yeah, so it's a broader term. There's different ways of saying it. Hunch operates in this space of, what we've identified as, the biggest need over the next, stage of, marketers' life is there's not enough creatives. And that's primarily driven by, pattern usages of social. If you think of like, if you look at the old way of doing things, like, 50 years ago, they would have one TV ad that would run for 3 months or 6 months, right? So you have a process of creating one TV ad, you put it on TV and it lasts for 6 months and everybody's happy. And then after 6 months, you see, hey, we have more sales, right? That was the old way of thinking. And then, the channel and the communication strategies changed. So it wasn't one to the masses, it's going one to one, right? So now on social, you are, like from Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or any other ones, your patterns, if you think of like thumbs, are super fast, right? So essentially you're swiping through content. There's more content creators than there ever were before. There's more products online than there ever were before. So we're constantly being offered certain things. And so what happens is your brain is, sort of different now. You have, your brain is actually super fast. In other words, how fast you make a decision.
And your ad blockers are actually very good.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have that up, but essentially we've been trained to flip through content, in a certain fashion that's super fast. So what that essentially means is that imagine that if we take the old video from 50 years ago and put it on social, somebody would just pass through it, and there's maybe 60 seconds of worth of that video. There was $5 million invested. So what's happening now is that pattern is sort of driving marketing departments that they need more content in shorter snippets that are more contextualized to you as an individual, so that you have less than 2 seconds to grab somebody's attention. And so what's happening now, the creative, the life of the image or the video is shorter in essence. And so what's driving lots of brands is they have to produce, thousands of images and videos in order to be competitive today. There's, creative fatigue and all these things. So what Hunch essentially solves for, it helps that, marketer, produce enough, or we enable them to produce enough images and videos that are, testing different things, that allows them to get, better responses, and in the end, better customers, right? And so, to your earlier point, marketing is different today than it was, yesterday, and it's changing, right? If you look at TikTok, it's a video-first environment, right? It's like you have to produce video. How many people do you know that can actually produce video, like that they were born with video editing capabilities? So that's what brands are asking. It's like, okay, how can they change their internal processes to compete today? So creative intelligence is just one term. It's creative automation. It's creative performance. it's scaling the creative, creative intelligence. You mentioned one, I think on our website, we have 3 or 4. But essentially, it's all revolving around the creative, because the way the platforms are developing, Facebook, Instagram, Snap, TikTok, and so forth, there's less what they would call options to target, or what we would call signaling headwind. In other words, with iOS 14, 15 updates, there's less of audience sort of targeting, which means that their AI is super strong in figuring out who's in the market for a specific product. And so the only lever, the strongest lever, and the only lever that brands can pull is the creative side. Is how can they be creative to, tell that story and, to essentially bring that customer in. And so that's what we help for. It's how do we, enable them to be more creative without, relying on, hundreds of people to do that.
Okay. And when we speak about being creative, do you think that we can now also automate part of that with all the AI?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that's definitely,
Is it realistic? And can it be used also for marketing?
Yeah, I think, from, artificial intelligence will definitely be an enhancer to, marketers, for sure. It's just a matter of how you use it. We have our own, we're building our own, let's say, thoughts on how to enable marketers to leverage models to be learning models or, AI to be more effective with their creative, for sure. So I think that's inevitable. It's a new category that's forming, generative AI in general.
Yes.
And creative is one in terms of image and video. How that will play out, how that will be, I don't think it will ever replace, marketers, for sure. I think it'll just enhance, and it'll make it easier for that marketer to tell that story in a way that he wants to tell it. There's definitely the production, let's call it the manufacturing of creative, is a process that is costly, it's time consuming, it involves, tens of different parties or entities in order to make that. So that's a cumbersome process. And I think there's opportunities in that process for AI to definitely make that smoother, easier, faster, just basically shorten the latency between when you send out a video or an image, when you create it, to what's working and what's not working, right? So that's, that will definitely become shorter and shorter, and it'll be in tune with the audience. And so, for us, we're definitely bullish on generative AI over the next years. As an organization, we are building for, the ability for marketers to leverage this. The idea is there's certain models, then there's your brand, like what you know about your customers, about the products, and how do you sort of combine the two, to be more efficient. So Hunch actually, incidentally, sits in a very nice position in that market because, when you have, generative AI, let's say, and then you have actual, let's call it, does it work or does it bring in revenues? Hunch is built out of the infrastructure for launching the creative, seeing if it works, right? And then if it works means that it's, bringing in users or customers, and it's, bringing in revenue. So we've built that infrastructure, so we're, now in a position to leverage, let's say hundreds of different ideas of a background to a video for a product, So I think, we're in a good position to leverage that. We've started to explore those opportunities. So yeah, I would say, like anything else, I think in every part, AI will enhance the knowledge worker. I don't think it will replace the knowledge worker.
And also the creative worker, because it's a different type of intelligence.
Yeah, we'll see. I think, without creatives, it's going to be hard, but yeah.
Because you're so much more focused on social media, I wanted to ask you maybe like a dumb question, but I see that being discussed again and again in startup companies that we work with, also in our own company. The old KPIs that we would be looking at, when it comes to conversion is always kind of like around traffic. How much traffic do we have on the website? And what we see right now is that you can actually have a very great brand awareness campaign, but also a selling campaign only on social media. So what happens with the good old-fashioned website, and does it still count? Like, what KPIs are we going to be looking at in the future when we want to get a sense of, is our marketing well spent or not?
Yeah, and that comes in different flavors, right? For different companies. Like for a gaming company, we don't have any, big gaming company as clients, but we know how they operate. It's like you might bring in a user who might download the app, right? Maybe he'll purchase something, and maybe you get 1,000 of these users. But then, you might acquire, a user that that in the end has a longer lifetime value in terms of purchases. So you want to be optimizing your marketing to those guys that have higher lifetime value, and actually maybe avoid these guys. So, not knowing what your internal KPIs are, but obviously, attention is one, let's call it currency, right? With which we're all sort of we're giving attention to the specific app or to specific. So how you monetize that attention, it's up to the business, right? But I would say from the perspective of like a media company, right? I think it's looking at metrics and fine tuning, for those actions that ultimately helps you, improve your bottom line, whatever that may be. So that's your KPIs. But the thing that technology does, it allows you to sort of have those levers to check the signals whether or not that is true, whether it's impacting your bottom line or not. So I think, a good example of that is yellow journalism, right? Think about it. Yellow journalism has just been optimizing for, for stories that are sensational, exactly. Right? To bring in a reader for, is that necessarily good? I think that's actually more damaging than, good.
It is.
Yeah. So I think, and there's a plenty of these, so I think, I'm not an expert on publishing or how, but I would say, it's definitely changing the way, social has definitely impacted the way media companies operate today.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I wanted to ask you about the other big shift that we are currently seeing from one generation to the next one. Like consumers have now, or consumers from the millennial generation and the consumers from the Gen Z generation, they're going to have a totally different mindset of how they consume content, how content makes them purchase certain things. What have you learned about this one? Because you've been a Meta partner.
Yeah, Meta business partner.
But you speak also a lot about TikTok, and actually both exist because they're different generations who are using the platforms. So what can we learn about Gen Z?
It's a good question. I don't know. I'm not an expert on on that, but I would, I can say from my vantage point that impulsiveness is definitely higher with the with younger people, younger generation. So I don't know. I wouldn't be able to give you a smart answer.
Okay.
Comparing the two. I think what's true is that the biggest difference, I think, in that pattern usage is the fact that we have now algorithms that people are aware of. And I'll give you an example. When I speak to my son, right? I already have that conversation of how to train the algorithm to give him content that he should be looking at.
How old is he?
Yeah, he's 12, right?
Okay.
And so we had this discussion earlier on when, for example, TikTok came about into, in the classroom, let's call it. And we had, an honest heart-to-heart in terms of like, how does it work, right? So I think, this is just my bias, right? But I think, I think people are aware and that they're innately training the algorithm. So if that changes their, purchasing behavior, I think it will. I think I think they're now aware of how they're interacting with the platforms. And I think, those brands that understand that, will have a better position, to carve out a niche of those customers, right? So if they understand that specific individuals want specific things, if they're building for contextualization, right? So in that example, when you're teaching the algorithm, perhaps you want to see only certain style of creative. So we go back to the creative, right? Maybe, let's say skaters, for example.
Okay.
Right? So let's go through an example of a company that sells shoes to its audience. If it sells shoes to a skater population, it should make that contextual, right? It should meet the content that's for the skater population. They love watching skater videos, they love skater gear, they love skater sort of angles. That shoe should be appeared in that specific, creative, right? Versus, let's say, just a broader, creative that's one shoe and it's on brand and it's, just one shoe and like one influencer. So that speaks volume to how brands will be changing in the future, because they'll have to build, storylines for many different parts of the audience. And ultimately, that, to go back to your question, between the generations, I think that's the difference, is people want, I think, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I think people want to have that experience where, they already know they're sharing data. Like, for example, I think everybody that's younger, they're okay with sharing data, for example, right? So
I think this is the most frustrating part, because in a way, we as users are being asked for our data all the time, and then you see, marketers not using it in the right way, and it's super. I mean, why would you send me this? I mean, exactly. Why is it so fucking generic?
So I would say, like, to say, like, I always use the example of, say, I have 3 boys, and so I say I want to be the dad of the year, right? But I don't have time to research all the great things that I should be doing with my sons. Right?
Okay.
So if I had a company, and this is, if any company out there targets fathers with 3 boys with activities, please turn on your ads. How can I have experiences, like hiking, this and that, that's targeting me? And I almost look at that as I invite that, right? I would want somebody to offer me certain things to make it easier, because, for me to go to Google and to search, and now through, flip through 1,000 different pieces of content, most of them are bullshit, to find the things that you want, right? That's a pain, right? So I think, that's part of what Hunch's mission is. It's to enable that, giving, those individuals that are in the market for something, an easier, faster way, and helping brands, with that.
Yeah, customer-centric, actually. I mean,
yeah,
we speak about it for so long, but
exactly.
we still haven't managed
it's creating
that.
those experiences, customers want. I look at myself, when I go to, a platform, I want the platform to offer me things that are of interest to me, not those that are not of interest to me. That's just my personal stance.
I get it. So you think that we are at this point already okay with lacking data privacy?
Yeah, I think that's a big topic, obviously. I wouldn't say that. I think there's definitely, data privacy is, should be dear to every company, and making sure that the data stays where it's supposed to stay, But I think the way companies use that data can be beneficial, right? So I don't know what the next generation is going to be like. I mean, I look at just the current generation that's in my house, and I say, like, I don't think that they're very aware, at least now. Maybe they will be when they're older, but I think it's like they believe, in the good of the world, and they'll share everything. And it's one of those things, like they were born when Google was already here, right? So it's like it's totally normal. They were born when all these platforms are there.
Do you teach them in some way media literacy? Do you somehow restrain their behavior on, I don't know, social media, on TikTok?
Oh yeah, of course. Like they don't have, none of them have phones.
Okay.
We have a very strict policy in terms of that.
Why?
And when we do, it's more active in terms of conversations. I mean, there's definitely some, you can't win on all battles. But we try to practice, and limit exposure, at least for the younger ones, right? The older ones are actually just not that. Like, he doesn't even have a phone, so I would say, But yeah, like you can't in today's world, when you can't really create a black sheep, because everybody is sharing information. I mean, in terms of like certain things, and like if the whole classroom, knows who that one guy is, who's like a YouTuber or something, you know what I mean? Like, how do you want to make sure that there's this like constant battle, I think.
But still, for you as someone who pretty much understands how algorithms are working, would you share, like, what are your concerns when you try to kind of, teach your kids of how to use social media in a responsible way?
Well, absolutely. I think you always have to have those conversations in everything, right? Yeah. Including social media. And like I mentioned before, I think we have those conversations around how that thing works. Mm-hmm. And we went through an exercise. It was like, hey.
Yeah, okay.
So, like we were on TikTok. It was like, okay, look, now I'm going to stop on this video. It's like a dog video. And I'm going to watch the whole video and let's see what happens. And then the next 4 videos are like, dog videos or something. And then we stop on something else. And like, so you see them, they're not stupid. They understand. At that level, they understand. And then there's always dangers and you always talk to, so I think they have to be literate and, they have to understand. I don't think that, to shield them and protect them and not have a conversation with them, I think that's doing them a disservice to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. You have to have a conversation with them about everything. And that's true for social as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, when we were growing up, we had different conversations with our parents. This is just like one that is coming now on top, I think.
Exactly.
It's very, very interesting. I wanted to maybe finish up a bit with exactly this responsibility that we as entrepreneurs tend to take upon ourselves. We spoke about the ecosystem. We spoke about also AI. I wonder now, do we as entrepreneurs and also innovators have a bigger role to play in the society, in your opinion, as those who are building, the next components of the future? How do you see that? How do you think about that?
I think absolutely. I think, build the future that you want, right? And that's part of every entrepreneur's dream, right? Is to create something to better society as a whole. I don't think there's any entrepreneur out there building something that can have a net negative impact on the society. I mean, everybody has their own view of what how to make an impact, but
do you trust, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg when he says that about himself? I mean, has been in a lot of controversy, and I think at some point he was even on some list like the most hated entrepreneur or tech founder.
Yeah. I would say, look, I think there's so much information out there, and there's so much disinformation out there. I take the stance almost like a Stoic would, right? So I would say, from my vantage point, I don't judge. I look at, in general, how that reflects. And, people have a decision, to use a product or not to use a product. Overwhelmingly, I think, people have spoken whether or not the product works for them or not, Mm-hmm. So, to say that, we're so far from, that level of influence that, what I think really doesn't matter, right? I think, for us, we believe in how to make a better experience on these platforms, right? And I think the people will say whether an experience is bad by being on the platform or not being on the platform, right? So I think, from our perspective, what others say is less important, I think, right? Because there's different reasons of why people say things, so that's what I've always thought is, I don't know why people are saying that. I can guarantee you if Mark Zuckerberg was sitting here, we would all believe that he's a nice person, right? Mm-hmm. And we would all believe that he has good intentions in the world, mm-hmm. right? So I don't know, why people write the things that they write, and neither, do I care. But I look at the data and I say, okay, the data shows that Meta's growing, right? And particularly the last quarter. So to me, that means that they're doing something right? That they're definitely listening to the customers and improving and so forth. Like everything else, anything you build is not ideal, it's not perfect. You keep a pulse on how to improve. Mm-hmm. By far of all of the platforms out there today, Meta is the largest. Facebook, Instagram. So both in terms of from an advertiser perspective, mm-hmm. it's probably the most important network to be on in terms of social. There's Google and there's Facebook in terms of advertising. And when you look at, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's somewhere like, out of every dollar on advertising on social, Meta takes, let's say 90 cents of that dollar. Roughly, maybe 85 cents, I don't know.
That's impressive. Yeah.
So it's basically tells you, right, that the brands believe that that's an important network to be on. They believe that their customers are there. They believe that the customers enjoy that platform, right? So, if you follow the data tells a different story than what the narrative that we might be served tells, right? If it was the way it's portrayed, I think it would be a much more dire and significant change than what it is today.
Just smile because we used to say follow the money. Now, actually, today we would rather say really follow the data.
In this case, it's both true for both. You're following the money and the data in terms of what brands believe, right?
I found it funny. So if you were a female founder, I would probably ask you about how do you combine a family with 3 kids and, being a founder, but we never asked that man. So can I actually do the experiment?
Sure.
How is it for you to be a male founder with 3 kids at home?
Yeah, it's definitely, enriching in terms of the context switching, right? Because when you're building a company, there's 1,000 things that you're thinking about. So, coming home and having that context switch, actually, in the end, your brain takes a break from all the other things, right? And I know that from my previous company where, it was, constantly, you're 24/7 thinking about something. So I think it's, from that perspective, from a selfishly perspective of how it improves me, I think it's definitely God-given to have, 3 kids at home. But how, that impacts, I think having, my wife is absolutely, the backbone of that organization, let's put it that way. So to me, it's without, support, without somebody leading that, she is the CEO, she handles everything. So to me, it would be unfair, to think of that as like, a success story, like a founder with 3 kids. It's ultimately, for me, when I look at, the family, the thing that I really need to improve on, I think every founder does that, is how do you schedule your calendar in a way, right? And that's the ultimate question, when you say, how do you, that's the trickiest part, I think, by having, 3 kids at home. It's how do you schedule time individually, collectively, and be, mindful of that. That's what I would say is the biggest challenge for me personally, is how do you do that? Because I'm, constantly thinking about the company, I'm constantly thinking about things, and it just eats your calendar. But you have to and this goes back again to, let's say, that earlier question, which is like mentorship and coaching and so forth, right? Like I didn't have that, right? So like now you're always in that example thinking about how do you come up with a system, right? Ideally, you would want somebody to say, no, look, here's what the system is, right? And just follow it. So you have to think of a system, ask ChatGPT about, hey, how do you do that, right? So I think, it's challenging. It's definitely rewarding, but most importantly, it's possible. I think to the message that you want to take away from this conversation to anybody who's listening about starting a company, that both are, mutually inclusive. They don't have to be exclusive, right? Properly defined and properly organized, you can definitely be successful, right? In building a company and having a strong family.
Do you think that we came to a point where we need to maybe say goodbye to this, hustling culture, like where you're always busy and...
I've never understood hustling, busy culture as a term that's defined. It's just a way of being for a lot of people. Maybe just another thing where people have defined it in order to say what it is. But ultimately, you have I can look at our company Hunch, and I know that there's individuals that wouldn't define themselves as hustling and always on. They would define themselves as passionate about what they're doing. And when you think about it, there's this great book or great mockery method. Somebody who wrote The Great CEO Within, and he describes these sort of 4 zones, if you will, right? And there's this zone of incompetence, zone of competence, zone of excellence, and zone of genius. And I really, really found myself in that. When you are in your zone of genius, right, you're essentially working on something and time flies. And you don't absolutely know how it flew, but you were in your zone of genius and it gave you energy. When you're in your zone of competence, or in zone of your excellence, right, it's something that you're really good at. And it sometimes gives you energy, sometimes takes away energy. It's something that in your organization you're probably the best at doing. You get asked to do it or you want to do it, but it's not something that like really gives you that because you've done it maybe 1,000 times or something, right? Then there's a zone. So that's, I would say, like a neutral for me. Sometimes gives you energy, sometimes takes away the energy or drains you, depending on the situation. And there's a zone of competence where like you know it, you're not the best. That's definitely energy draining, right? It's definitely it's something that takes more energy to complete. It's it's something that you have to think of. And then there's a zone of incompetence, like for example, something that as you're building an organization, maybe like HR or legal or finance stuff that's energy draining. Those are the things that are things that So when you talk about hustle, right? Like if you define properly what that means, if you're in your zone of genius, you're essentially not hustling, right? You're essentially enjoying yourself doing what you want to do, right? You're actually like, if it's product and ideation, if you're coding, or maybe an architect that's building a building, you spend hours of building that building and hours have gone by. You're not hustling, right? So I have a problem with that, specific sort of nomenclature. But if you define that within those four terms that Mockery, defined, I would say that in operating in those, you want to be in that zone of genius. This is where you're flourishing. This is where you're actually giving, you're driven. And all the other ones, you want to find ways to either find somebody else whose zone of genius that is. Yeah, and then you don't have that problem with hustle. You don't have that problem with doing all these things.
Thank you. I feel so lucky because I actually get my mentors from the podcast that I'm doing. And I think it just gave me like a direction where I would say, okay, this is what I want to achieve in my calendar, at least.
There you go.
I don't have the 3 kids yet, but yeah. I would like to spend a bit more time in the zone of genius. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It was a great pleasure having this conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
Next on the Recursive podcast, the co-founder and board member at Scale Focus, Victor Bilansky.
I don't think there will be ever a situation in time where, we or every business should say, we've done it. Mm-hmm. Because there is always competition, and companies are always getting better and better. And if you stop, then someone else will take your chair, and then you need to catch up. Sure. So it's a never-ending game. Actually, the companies are, I would say, like in nature, there is evolution, right? Mm-hmm. The same things is with business. Some companies die, some companies grow. There are new companies popping up like every day. It's never-ending story. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say there is a point of time or let's say milestone achieving which you can say, we've done it.
And if you're just as passionate about innovation as we are, hit subscribe for the Recursive podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. We're everywhere.